So as far as talking about 12 Angry Men, the logical thing it would probably seem to do would be to talk about another movie that's sort of like in that chamber piece vibe where there's only so many characters and the locations are really limited. But the more I thought about it, the more it was like, well, how about instead of sticking with that, sticking with the Sidney Lumet connection as well as the Courtroom connection, and bring the Verdict into this. So, and I guess you could say, as far as something apart from those that they have really like greatly in common, is the fact that both movies could probably be considered sort of a completely different approach to the courtroom movie, like where somebody's bringing up courtroom dramas, and these two should come up. You would think, yeah, kind of, but in like a totally non-traditional sense. We'll go more into how the Verdict falls in that category, but I actually want to start with 12 Angry Men. This is the way that I own the Verdict. It's a little weird that the least popular movie here is on the top, but I think they are ordered in alphabetical order by the title. But yeah, so because I'd love to talk about The Hustler at some point also. But in the meantime, talking about 12 Angry Men, which is a movie that has been talked about to death. It's studied in not just film schools, but I think just kind of schools in general for one reason or another. And it's so I really don't know what has or hasn't even been touched on, or if you can even get in that direction. But I'll just talk about the reasons that I like it and see where we end up. So there's that. So obviously the concept is pretty well known. We have, apart from the opening scene when they're in the court, and the final scene when they're right outside the courthouse, we really only get one, technically two locations. We've got the jury room, and then every now and then we've got the bathroom. But for the most part, we're stuck in one location with these 12 dudes, just to see how far things can go when most of them, appear to think that this case is completely open and shut, except for Henry Fonda, who now has to convince the other 11 against what they so clearly believe because they need a unanimous decision. So, and this just happens to be the hottest day of the year, and Jack Warden discovers very quickly that the fan in this room, supposedly, doesn't even work. So, obviously, we get that vibe immediately. We get these little clues throughout this opening scene of just how all the different things that are going to come into play to raise the tension as this goes on. And we've got a whole bunch of recognizable faces who weren't all recognizable at the time. Of course, our foreman is Martin Balsam, who you would later know as Arbogast in Psycho, and he won an Oscar for A Thousand Clowns, which is an amazing performance. And then you've got Lee J. Cobb, he'd already done On the Waterfront by this point. Yes, they're 3 years apart. And of course, he's the one that's like the veteran juror, and he feels like he's seen everything before, and he knows everything, and he can pretty much call a case just by looking at it. And we've got Jack Warden and Ed Begley, who are equally aggressive to him in regard to their conviction. It's just a matter of what exactly they're driven by, is what's going to eventually be revealed. Like in Jack Warden's case, it might just be a baseball game he really wants to catch. In Ed Begley's case, it might be more a sort of racism, but that gets more and more volatile as it goes and the tensions rise. You've got a great performance from E.J. Marshall, who's kind of the reasonable one of the bunch, and kind of goes at everything, and kind of has that logical sense about him and doesn't get so as caught up in emotion as some of the others might. We also got Edward Benz, who would go on to play the bishop in The Verdict. So him on top of Jack Warden, we actually have 2 returning cast members between the 2 movies also. And even to kind of throw in for like, almost kind of it feels like for the sake of a more realistic approach, a viewpoint that you would probably imagine if you were actually a fly on the wall in a room like this. Because you've got all the big, dramatic personalities and all the really theatrical personalities. But then you've got the one guy in there, the dude that's like really timid and basically just kind of goes with whatever, which is totally the type of person you could imagine seeing in a real situation like this. The guy that says, when he's asked to explain why he's voted guilty, and his response is just, well, I can't really put it into words, I just think so. And then later he mentions something being interesting, and when they ask him why, he just says, I don't know. It's just interesting. And it's like it's just somebody so passive like that you would imagine also in here. So it's like, the fact that they put those kind of personalities in where not everything is necessarily like not every character is going to turn into a big monologue, and I think that helps a lot. Not just kind of support the scenes and kind of give them that grounded nature, but it actually helps to amplify the people that do have to get dramatic and kind of makes that hit a little more when you've got kind of that balance going on. So there's that. But talking about all that and how dramatic it gets and theatrical it might get, I love that the whole setup, like the whole start of the conflict, is done in like the least dramatic way possible. Where you've got them going through the votes, and obviously there is the one not guilty, and they ask who voted guilty and who didn't, and just Fonda raises his hand, and that's about it. Like the way it's shot, the way it's presented to us, it plays it up like it's not that big a deal. It's just an event that's happening. Like it's a minor conflict, and then little do we realize, unless you know going into it, of course, that this will be the movie. Something that was just presented so undramatically is the movie from then on, and that's it. And I really love the way they do that and the way they present the different things we need to know that we didn't, because it's in such a enclosed space and they don't want to bombard us with like really obvious exposition. So they just kind of gradually show us or give us the details of the case, the way they go around the table, and it's like it's an ingenious way to show, like, to present it to us as the audience, to have them say, so why do you think he's guilty? And this, obviously when they explain that, they're going to be going into detail about the pieces of the case that are the most crucial, and then it's just gradually revealed to us kind of piece by piece, and then by the time the movie's over, it's like we know the whole ins and outs of everything because I have to go through it over and over and over again, which you would think would grow tiresome even in just the mere hour and a half that this is. But it's the way they always, there's always just one more slight twist on something we already know every time it's brought up again, and this is basically the pattern throughout the movie that just kind of keeps it building and keeps it amping up, especially with the, that's not even to mention the personalities getting bigger and the hostile attitude towards, from some characters to others, getting more and more amplified. So that's just that whole, just the whole concept just works in so many ways. Whether it be, I think it was like there was something about it, like a TV play or something, and then you can imagine on the stage, you can imagine it as a movie. There's so many different mediums you could put this into, and it still works, which I think is really great. And then you talk about the Fonda character. Juror number 8, which I also think is kind of a genius move, where it's like, you think about this kind of story having a protagonist, because when you look at it, this movie got 3 Oscar nominations, and they were 3 major ones, with picture, director, and screenplay. But you'll notice that none of the actors were, and while that might make you may make your head want to explode right away as soon as you hear that, I do think it must have had something to do with the fact that how do you really single anybody out in this cast? Because even with Fonda, you know, obviously being the lead, and apparently he was so into the idea of the movie, like he was so into the script, that it's a lot of his own money went into making sure it got made. So I mean, it's really clear to say he's the protagonist and the lead, but it's still such an ensemble at the same time, even if there's kind of a character at the heart of it that kind of serves as a protagonist. It all just feels like the whole 12-person ensemble just kind of feels like one big entity in itself. So, but what I think makes it work, to have this character as a protagonist, number one, it would have been very easy to have a protagonist and Henry Fonda's face on this protagonist and say, well, he's, you know, like you'd make him almost the jury foreman, you would think, another story would, to kind of put him in a position of being like the main character. But he's just juror number 8. He's just right in the middle. And I always thought that was a great way to do that. But also talking about kind of the stoic dignity that Fonda brings to the character, because I can imagine this movie going another direction with somebody that isn't Fonda. They've done a couple of remakes also. One that was made for TV in like 1997, I want to say, that also has an amazing cast. But I mean, just Fonda in particular, and I want to say it's Jack Lemmon in the TV movie. I can imagine. I haven't seen that version, but I can imagine this also. But you have to have that dignity that he brings to the character and that sort of Henry Fonda type, because I feel like if you had an actor that couldn't bring that, juror number 8 would really come off as like a borderline conspiracy theorist, and it'd be kind of really hard to side with him, and you have to really make that work to not believe the 11 other people in the room and believe the one guy. That's what the whole concept, that's like the whole foundation of the thing. And it's like, you have to, every time he goes into a new thing about, well, let's look at it this way and this thing, and he goes into all the details, and it's like, these could be the ravings of a delusional person if it wasn't a character or an actor or somebody that you really couldn't believe in that moment. And I think it's because it's, you know, Henry Fonda's got that face and that voice and just that general way about him that you just believe him. And I think that's a really crucial part in how you go into this when you see all this stuff. And then as more of the reveals happen, obviously one of the big, like, hair-raising moments in the entire movie is the knife scene. And just that, and that alone, like, that does work by itself, absolutely. And it's, like, so convincing in its portrayal, but at the same time, you've still got to have that actor that can carry those scenes and that's what makes that scene hit so hard, and then it goes on, and we just kind of start to believe his theories more and more as it goes, and the way the jurors kind of start to slowly turn around. I love, like, the progress we see throughout the movie. Every time they take a vote, and it's, like, slowly turning in that direction. But of course, there's always the few people that remain as obstacles. So there's that. And then the whole idea of talking about where some of them are coming from, like what some of their motives might be. Whether it be, you know, Lee J. Cobb wanting to basically be an executioner and wanting to be like a sadist, as he's eventually called, or Ed Begley's racism. And it's like, I love the idea that a lot of the beginning of the movie is them talking about the kid's background and how it's, well, we got to immediately base this on, and they kind of touch on this pretty blatantly when Lee J. Cobb goes to attack him, and he says, "I'm gonna kill you," and he's like, you know, "Oh, do you mean that?" And kind of turns that around on him. But I think it feels like something that you can kind of relate to all of the jurors when it's like when they start to kind of analyze, like, his background. It's like, well, what made him into this to make these certain decisions or potential decisions that he made? And it's like, it kind of makes you start to wonder that about all of the jurors. I mean, obviously Lee J. Cobb is the most obvious of those. But some of them also, like even E.J. Marshall, the really reasonable one of the bunch, it almost like it makes you want to know his background, to know what he's seen or what he hasn't seen or experienced or hasn't experienced, and how much that's coming into play with how they're thinking about the case itself. And I like the way that it mirrors the way they talk about the kid's background, so there's that. And then obviously the technical aspects really start to come into play also, where it's there's obviously, like, you know, the lenses where it's like everything feels really wide at the start, and then it kind of feels like it's slowly starting to come in. There's a lot more close-ups towards the end, and it's kind of like the walls and the ceiling feel like they're starting to show up in the frame more, and like everything's closing in. But there's also some cases, like the sound of the rain, I always loved, was a really nice addition to that. And it's the E.J. Marshall scene in particular when they're interrogating him about the movies that he saw. And it's like that's when the close-ups kind of start to happen, and then the sound of the rain is like getting louder and louder as it goes. And it's like you would think, and that's one of the main brilliant things about the movie is it's one of those movies where a lot of people like to give it the, you know, the rave review of, oh, it's just guys in a room and it's amazing and it's riveting or whatever. But it's like, how much goes into that to where it's not necessarily just the dialogue or the way the characters act to each other, but everything that's kind of going on in this very limited background also is really great also. And I like the idea of having the bathroom there also. So every now and then we'll get like two characters that get like time by themselves away from all like the ruckus of everybody else going off. And it's all just done there. There's a book that Sidney Lumet has called Making Movies, I want to say, that's like really, that goes into like so much detail about particularly the making of this movie and all those different details you can find there. And it's like, it's basically like a textbook. And it's, yeah, so the movie is like, when you look at the cast, it's an acting masterclass, it's a writing and character masterclass, and obviously it's a directing masterclass. And that's, what else can you really add to that? And then of course the cherry on top, that the whole point isn't necessarily if the kid actually did it or not, or if the verdict is right or not. And it's, can you imagine? Can you imagine if for some reason this movie ended with one last tacked on scene where we found out for sure if the kid was actually guilty or not? It would be the most hated scene in movie history, right next to the psychologist scene in Psycho. There would be, that would almost, I don't know, but there's no reason to get all wrapped up in that, because it's not there, and we're so glad that it's not there, because that's not the point. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything else to add to that, or if there's anything I can say that you don't already know, because if you're watching this, I'm sure you're a massive fan. So that's pretty much how I feel about 12 Angry Men. And then going into the verdict, which started off as a novel and then was adapted by David Mamet. So you know the dialogue is going to be on fucking fire. And of course it's Lumet again, and this time working with Paul Newman. And the Paul Newman character being an alcoholic that has since pretty much lost his peak form as a lawyer, and so he's an ambulance chaser now. He's showing up at funerals and like bribing people just to get people his business card, and it's just a pathetic existence. And the saddest part is that he is well aware of that, and it's got him in the worst place possible and only making his alcoholism worse. Just the shittier his life is. So when you look at that, you come back to what we were saying, where it doesn't feel like a conventional courtroom movie, and that's the fact that it's kind of, this might sound weird, but hear me out. I feel like it's kind of comparable to Rocky, in the sense of, you could say The Verdict is a courtroom movie the way Rocky is a boxing movie. And if you haven't seen Rocky in a while, you may or may not remember that Rocky has one main boxing match in it. He's like sparring in the gym a little bit at the beginning, but there's only one boxing match in it, the fight with Apollo. And the same thing comes across with The Verdict. It's only really a courtroom drama in like the last 25 minutes to half an hour, and the movie is a little over 2 hours. It's like 2 hours and 10 minutes. So that's a huge chunk of the movie not spent in a courtroom. And obviously, because the thing about that also is, it's got, both of them have that sort of obvious formula that the genre can't escape. It's like when you look at courtroom dramas, you have the stuff where like you're gonna have the guy that looks like he totally can't win the case, and you're gonna have people that doubt that he can. You're gonna have the really great lawyer on the other side that he has to go up against, that's played by the veteran actor that gives this incredible performance. And then there's going to be stuff comes up, there's going to be turns in the story to where it's like, oh, maybe there'll be a surprise witness here, or maybe the other side will do this thing to fuck them over, and then there'll just be constant obstacles. And then eventually they'll come back and they'll win the case in a really big way. It's the formula we all know. The question is how they go about it. And the thing is that they decide to make it like they go into the character work and sort of that powerful story of like getting back to your peak form, or at least the best that you can, or maintain your reputation, your self-respect, all that stuff. And the way Newman is able to bring this out, because a lot of the movie uses like silence. Like, it's not a big movie at all. Much like we were talking about with 12 Angry Men, where it's like the whole setup of it is in like the most non-dramatic way possible, despite the fact that super dramatic things are happening. It's just they're so subtle about it, you may not always realize when the super dramatic stuff is. And so there are moments like and that's the thing too, is climax, like the courtroom climax, is basically just the cherry on top of all this other stuff, because all this stuff is so engrossing in itself, and they're kind of what makes the movie. Um, in the fact that you have those developments that come in that you expect, like the ones that fucking over, like the whole Charlotte Rambling storyline, where he like really opens up to her, and then it turns out that she's working for James Mason, of course. And the thing about that is, you think about the way those things affect the case second. The first thing you think about is how they affect him as a person. So that's really where the real strengths of the movie are, and the fact, and the way Newman gets like such, really gets to shine in a part like this. And it was, to my understanding, at the time, it was sort of like later in his career, especially with like by the time The Color of Money was happening and stuff like that. Um, Later, Newman kind of got known for roles like this, but to my understanding, it was still pretty unusual for him to act like this and kind of look like this when this movie came out. So it seemed like a really sort of drastic turn. That, like I said, if you're more familiar with his later work, may not seem as bizarre, but it was, to my understanding, it was a little from out of nowhere at the time of the movie. So, um, and then like I was saying, you got those silences where, like, when he goes into the, like, the care unit, and he's finally comes to that conclusion, and he, like, sees her there, and you can just kind of see it all come over him in, like, total silence, and like, they barely make a big deal out of it at all. And there's the fact that this movie has a score at all is barely noticeable, which is kind of amazing. But that moment when they just say, you know, who are you? And he just says, I'm her attorney. And then from then on, it's like a whole kind of turning point with this character. But like I said, not in a huge way. But if you're like really, really watching him and see kind of all the subtleties he puts into it, and like kind of the expressions that don't go too over the top, there's so much you can see in him. If all else fails, go through the eyes, and you'll see so much of what like a masterclass talent like Newman could do. So then you have those moments where it kind of totally, because we were talking about him basically being at rock bottom. These moments that just like totally and completely tear his profession to shreds. Like when he's talking to the victim's family, and they're saying, like, you know, there's a really powerful line where the guy says, people like us have to live with the mistakes you make for the rest of your life. Something like that. And then he says, you know, you're all the same. And he ends up hearing that from somebody else later, the woman that calls them whores because of what they do. And you can just see the way it's like, you can see in his eyes where he kind of comes to the conclusion that this is really what he's become, but it hurts even more so because all these things happen after his turning point, where he knows what he has to do, not just to gain back his, you know, dignity and self-respect and his reputation to an extent, but the fact that it's the right thing to do also, to you know, say fuck the settlement and go after them as much as you possibly can. And that's the stuff that really makes the movie, kind of builds it into something much more than just your average sort of, like, it goes full into like being the whole character study sort of thing, rather than just the entirely focusing on the courtroom stuff and the mechanics of that and all that. But then yes, when we do get more into that, we do have a, I suppose you could say, antagonist of sorts in James Mason, who, like Newman, scored an Oscar nomination for his work here, and I feel like it's gotta be one of the most James Mason roles in his entire very long career. Like, whenever, like, there's so many comedians that have a James Mason impression, and every time I hear a comedian do a James Mason impression, I feel like they're doing an impression of Ed Concannon from this movie. So that, and the way that he's got that sort of unstoppable vibe to him throughout the entire thing is all the more, we love it all the more when we get to the later scenes and we can see that his case is kind of starting to crumble a little bit, and Newman might possibly be winning, especially when we get the whole Lindsay Krause scene, and you can see him start to panic in the middle of the courtroom. And I love that that's kind of, it's like one of those things that kind of, you almost don't expect to see it from this character. So it like actually catches you by surprise when you see him like start to wonder if his case is gonna fall apart, and it's amazing. And talking about like we were talking about 12 Angry Men, going into like some of the technical aspects, I really love the way the Verdict is shot, like so much, because with 12 Angry Men you're just kind of in one place for the most part, and Lumet showed that there's a lot you can do with that. But the Verdict is in quite a few places, but it's still there's still such a stationary way that it's shot that I really love, where the camera does not move much at all, and there are scenes that can go for quite a while without there being a cut, where the camera's just kind of in one place and it might ever so gently follow somebody just to come back to where it was, and not show off in any way whatsoever. And that really does a lot for the pacing of scenes also. It's like like for instance one of the opening scenes at the funeral, when he pays off the dude, and then he uses the breath spray, and then he goes in and he gives his card, does his sleazy little thing, and then he walks out the opposite door, and it's like you don't even realize right away that's all one shot. And it's because it's just so smooth. You've also got the moment in the care unit I was talking about, when he has like kind of his, not his epiphany, but the scene before that, when he just tracks her down. Then there's that moment when he's sitting in the guy's bed and the guy just wheels up and asks for his bed. Just little moments like that work also. But all this, him going around this whole room, is just one shot by itself without being showy about it. There's a scene when they're in that library and he and Jack Warden are working, and then Warden goes up that spiral staircase, grabs something, and comes back down, and the camera's sitting still practically. He just moved just a little bit to show him go up their stairs, and it's like it's just such a. There's just something about capturing things in that way that feels so like the scenes feel more real, I guess. Like they feel less dramatized, and it's sort of like it almost kind of gives you that fly on the wall vibe. And the best way they obviously did this was the final speech, like the big Newman scene. Like a lot of people consider it to be like one of the best scenes, if not the best scene in Newman's career. And the great thing about this is not only are they dialing it back the way they shoot it, where most of the speech the camera's in one place and we're kind of at a distant shot of Newman. And it's only when he's talking to the jury we kind of start to pull in on him a little bit, push in on him a little bit. And it's so not dramatic about it. And it's like, because you think about it and you say, possibly the scene of Paul Newman's career was a big final courtroom scene. And you're so used to cliches, this is the last thing you expect to see. Because it's not him yelling, it's not super dramatic, and there's like no cuts in it, and the camera barely moves. And it's like one of the quintessential courtroom scenes, if not right at the top. And it's like, it's amazing. So, yeah, and just like I was talking about with the whole, it is able to do the formula, but in ways where you really, really feel it because of how he makes you feel that character. Where it's in the whole moment where you see like the whole downfall of his, where he's kind of in that moment where he's like, oh, we're gonna win, I can do this, we can win. I think there's even a moment that almost feels comedic in the middle, when it almost seems to cut immediately from him saying we're gonna win to him saying we're gonna lose to Charlotte Rampling. And it's in these moments where it feels like we come full circle, because it's like you can almost start to see in these moments, we almost see in a different way how he got here, like how he got to rock bottom, and then to see that come back around again, to him triumphing in this case, is just like the ultimate payoff. I know there's some ambiguity to the last scene when he's drinking, and a lot of people assume that okay, he's got this, but he's still there, maybe. But to my understanding, at some point, Paul Newman confirmed that he's actually drinking coffee in the last shot. So, take that for what you will. So, yeah. Obviously, long story short, there's a reason Sidney Lumet was one of the, like, all-time great directors, and we've only touched on very, very little of his filmography in these sort of videos, but I'm sure he'll be coming back, so we'll talk more about him, I'm sure. And yeah, I mean, if I had to choose between the two, obviously I love what The Verdict does for all the reasons stated, but as I said, 12 Angry Men is like a masterclass in every single aspect that is in the movie. So I think it's pretty clear, and it's like its reputation is just like getting just when you think 12 Angry Men's reputation can't get any bigger, it feels like it gets bigger with like every year, and it is always finding a new audience, and it's always been considered one of the greatest movies of all time, but that's probably only going to get bigger and bigger the more audiences find it, because every audience that does find it seems to have hardly anything negative to say about it at all, and not just not saying anything negative, but saying things that are so overwhelmingly positive about everything about it. So yeah, so I think we're going to end this now that that dog outside has started up again, and he's going to do that all fucking night too, so that's going to be great. So we are going to go in a bit of a different, actually a totally different area when we go into the next video. But before that, after this, we're going to have another Stephen King video, and we will have some reviews on Friday. So all that. So we're back to normal for a little bit, but we'll see, like I said, how the reviews happen as we go from week to week. But these and the King videos will remain normal for the time being. So until all that stuff, I think that's it.